Hello, I'm Lynn Forester de Rothschild, a co-chair of the Council for Inclusive Capitalism at the Vatican. I'm thrilled to be joined by two of my fellow co-chairs, Roger Ferguson, CEO of TIAA, the leading provider of financial services in the academic, research, medical, and government industries, and Brian Moynihan, CEO of Bank of America, and chair of the World Economic Forum's International Business Council. Thank you both for joining us today.
Great to be here.
Thanks for inviting me, Len.
Roger, I'd love to start with you. When we first met with the Holy Father, he said to us, "Dear friends, you have set before yourselves the goal of extending the opportunities and benefits of our economic system to all people." Of course, it was said in Italian, but translated for us. And he has called on the financial industry to play a role in closing the human dignity gap by investing in a manner that reduces inequality and increases financial inclusion. What are practical ways in which the financial services industry can take up this challenge?
Well, thank you, Lynn. It's my pleasure to respond to the question of what it is that we in financial services can do to take up the Pontiff's challenge around supporting inclusive growth and what our company, TIAA, has been doing. So let me start by saying that TIAA has long viewed its role, its position as an asset manager, as one of investing in order to increase inclusion. Let me just read a quote from my predecessor, Bill Greeno. He said in 1971, and I quote, "A corporation can only continue to be a profitable investment for its stockholders if it discharges its obligations to society." And that first appeared in 1971. So what are we doing to help the companies in which we invest discharge their obligations to society, as Bill said? Well, we encourage the companies in which we invest to consider the impact of their operations on a broader set of stakeholders beyond just shareholders. So customers, employees, suppliers, the larger community, the environment. We've long believed that this multi-stakeholder approach contributes to performance and helps reduce the risks in our investments, thereby increasing over time the risk-adjusted return that's possible. And we've encouraged other asset managers to do exactly the same thing. We believe that shareholder value is created as a result of business serving this broader set of stakeholders, as well as thinking about shareholder performance. And so a number of things that we've done include, one, a strong commitment towards promoting diversity and improved governance in all of our investments. We recognize that boards that are more diverse, companies that are more diverse, are likely to have better outcomes. There's data and evidence that is suggesting that. So we have a gender board diversity engagement initiatives, which is an example. It's a priority for us. And it's built on the premise that change starts at the top, that starts at the board level. So for the last couple of years, since 2018, we've engaged about 500 small and mid-cap companies in the US and Japan that did not have any women on their boards. And as of 2019, more than 30% had added at least one female director. This year in 2020, we engaged with even more companies, about 825 in all in the US and Japan, which did not have any women on their boards. And in September of this year, more than 40% of those companies have added a female director. And in fact, we formally announced in our fund complex, we adopted a policy in 2019 to vote against nominating and governance committees at US companies without gender diversity on their boards. And this year, our fund complex further strengthened its US voting policy to vote against directors, nominated directors, who are accountable for the oversight of board quality and nomination of directors to the board if that board does not include at least 2 women. And we've also launched an inclusive talent management engagement initiative early this year to interact with the target 75 companies in industries where diversity and inclusion has been identified as a competitive priority for talent and employee productivity. And in fact, this year, we supported 100% of the diversity and inclusion proposals at U.S. companies, which were mainly focused in on pay equity. And so one of the ways that we're driving towards greater inclusion in capitalism is to use our vote and our voice and our engagement capabilities to interact with publicly traded companies where we are a shareholder to drive for more diversity and inclusion at the board table, believing that that will lead to both better outcomes, but also a better focus in organizations throughout the organization on diversity and inclusion. So those are some of the ways in which we believe we are, supporting the Partners Challenge. We also have a very strong program in supplier diversity, both internationally and domestic. And then our bank is committed to investing in the communities we serve and plans to make qualifying investments throughout its designated CRA assessment area in proportion to the distribution of its deposits. And finally, we're a large insurance company, as you know, TIAA. Therefore, we have a general account, and our general account will provide impact-focused investments that meet the long-term investment needs of our participants, while also providing positive social and/or environmental outcomes. And so we believe that we've used many of our tools and levers to drive towards more inclusive capitalism. And we think that is responsive to the Pope's challenge to us when we met with him in the Vatican.
And Brian, in his 2015 encyclical, the Laudato Si, Pope Francis encouraged the world to listen to the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor. And he encouraged us to adopt an approach to investments that takes sustainability into consideration. As chair of the World Economic Forum International Business Council, you've proposed some universal measurements for sustainable value creation. How is the work of the Council for Inclusive Capitalism at the Vatican aligned with the International Business Council's work? And why is it important that the Council maps its commitments to advance the UN Sustainable Development Goals?
I think the number one thing is that we need to align the work of this council with the other work going on, so we don't end up with a bunch of things sort of doing the same thing but being slightly different. Because we all have one goal in mind, and that is to drive the Sustainable Development Goals, which by their definition define what is stakeholder capitalism, what is sustainable development, and the different, what would be the moral way forward that the pontiff has laid out in his encyclicals across time. So it's sort of a starter to say, how do we align capitalism to solve these big problems? But importantly, how do we make sure capitalism is actually solving those big problems? So in my colleague Roger's discussion, he talked about, as an investor, how they think about nudging management teams and boards in the right direction through their votes and through what they do and how they engage with them. But the real question came down to, we needed a way to define it. So the International Business Council, in trying to define long-termism and trying to find stakeholder capitalism, and what is 100% consistent with the Council on Inclusive Capitalism, defining inclusive capitalism, basically said we need to come up with a set of metrics that we can hold the business community accountable for, that investors can see that we're making progress, that society we can see we're making progress, that customers can see we're making progress. And the question was, okay, what are those metrics going to be? And what better place to go than to go to the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, which are adopted by 190 plus countries, and say, okay, they ought to align against that. So 21 metrics against the 4 basic principles of people, prosperity, planet, and governance. Really saying, if a company does these things, then investors and customers and employees and society writ large can look at them and say that company has committed a path forward, which is consistent with sustainable growth, with sustainable capitalism, with inclusive capitalism, and I can measure their progress. That will then allow the entire capitalism system to align to driving the change. And that was the goal of the IBC metrics. Now, when we started with inclusive capitalism, we added obviously some thinking around what inclusion meant and other things we'll talk about. But the core was, instead of defining another set of goals, let's make sure we don't spend so much time on the goals, but let's spend some time on the principles and getting people to actually take action under those goals. And then make sure those goals are aligned with the Catholic Church and the Pope, who has, a very persuasive, sway in the world to say, yes, if this is good enough, this defines inclusive capitalism, and these companies are doing, capitalism's doing what it's supposed to do. Capitalism has a moral placement. Capitalism is making the progress it's supposed to make. That's the key of all this. But without a measurement system, everybody will define what that means. And now we have in international business councils, the metrics, the big four accounting firms that I worked on, a measurement system to hold ourselves accountable, not people accountable, ourselves accountable.
Fantastic. Accountability can't be there without measurement. Thank you so much for that great contribution. And Roger, I'd like to move on to another problem in the world, and that's the COVID-19 pandemic. The last several months, seems like forever, has put a spotlight on systemic problems like unequal access to opportunity in healthcare. And we're witnessing obvious levels of racial and ethnic discrimination that keeps way too many people from participating in the full benefits of our economic, health, and education systems. Why is it important that business and capital play a role in breaking down these barriers? And what is the best role for the guardians for inclusive capitalism to play in solving these problems?
It is very important for business and capital to play a role in breaking down these racial barriers for two separate reasons. One is it's morally right. It seems inappropriate to have a society of vast inequality based on color of one's skin. In addition, maybe less important, but we should bring it up as well. There have been studies, one by McKinsey, that showed that if we close the racial wealth gap, the economy itself, the GDP, could be larger by 4% to 6% by the end of this decade. And so, if the moral argument doesn't persuade you, perhaps the fact that our GDP could be larger by closing the wealth gap across races might be persuasive for a few folks as well. And we should just talk about some of the numbers that come forward here. You've indicated that the COVID virus has shown some stark differences, and indeed it has. Blacks make up about 13% of the US population, but about 23% of COVID-19 deaths. When it comes to income and wealth, white families here have about 10 times the wealth of Black families in America. The Black median household income is around 60% that of white households, and it's well understood that unemployment rates among Blacks are often much higher than white folks with exactly the same education. And you talked a bit about health outcomes. Nearly 10% of Blacks lack health insurance versus about 5% of whites. So we believe that all individuals in all sectors have a role to play in driving forward against this scourge of racial inequality. Companies and organizations specifically must make sure that their own houses are in order as the first step. And so, we at our company at TIAA, we're proud of our history of diversity and inclusion. It is a cornerstone of our culture. It is part of our DNA. It's, as I said, both the right thing to do for moral reasons, but also for ethical reasons and for business reasons. So let me give you some statistics. We were the first insurance company to have an African-American officer, and that was in the 1950s. In the 1940s, we were the first insurance company to have a woman on our board, an African-American for the first time in the 1950s. My predecessor, Clifton Warden, the iconic CEO of this company, was the first African-American CEO of a Fortune 100 company when he was appointed in the 80s. And my board today, the TI Board of Trustees, has reached gender parity with approximately 54% female representation. And I think we're the first or one of the few major financial services companies to reach gender parity at the board level. And minorities account for 38% of the Board of Trustees and 60% of the executive management team. So one of the first things that all companies must do, including the guardians, is to walk the talk, I think would be the phrase, to show support for inclusion and diversity at the board table, and then then on down. I think the second thing that guardians can do, and certainly we've tried to do, is to respond very visibly to the challenges of racism that have become so visible during the course of this summer. So we launched over the summer a Be the Change initiative, through which TIAA is committed to challenging systemic racism by adopting and promoting policies within our own organization and offering programs and educational resources to foster a more inclusive environment. And we talk about Be the Change, and we talk about change through four components. Change through understanding, which is helping our associates to learn proactively what's happening around them. Change through dialogue, again, creating opportunities to have, frankly, some very tough conversations, but ones that are sort of eye-opening for everybody. Change through leadership, doubling down and building strong, diverse cultures and showing allyship throughout the organization. And then change through action, reaching out into our communities to drive change. This fall, we had a book reading where we had a great novel, Small Great Things, which focused in on racism of various types and had a good conversation there that was eye-opening, including inviting the author, Jodi Picoult, to talk to literally hundreds of our associates. And we'll continue to drive the Be the Change activities. So those are some of the things that we think any of us can do. We've also partnered with others. So we have partnered with HBCUs, historically Black colleges and universities, to provide opportunities for underrepresented minorities to grow their careers in the financial services sector. And over the next 2 years, our goal is to increase the number of HBCUs individuals who are participating in our early talent program by about 50%. So these are just some examples of what all of us can do. First, recognize and understand the numbers, the data, and then think about our own house in terms of diversity and inclusion, and then think about reaching out to communities in different ways to try to chip away at this scourge of racism. So Lynn, we think there's much that can be done to make this a better place in this regard.
That's wonderful. That's a great example of a race to the top example that you give to all of us. And it's really what the council wants to do for all of our colleagues around the world. Brian, in this post-COVID-19 world, Pope Francis has called not just for recovery, but for regeneration of the global economy, so it operates morally and according to the long-term common good. This really gets to the heart of our mission at the Council for Inclusive Capitalism. So with growing inequality, climate change, the humanitarian crisis brought on by COVID-19, the racial injustices that we see, how is Bank of America using its investment approach to deploy capital in new ways to create an economic system that's more inclusive and sustainable?
The basic question is, with the multiple crises going on in the world, the healthcare crisis, which is one in the United States, especially a social justice, racial justice crisis. And then you have the environmental crisis, which is, again, global. And so as we think about our company, we drive what we call responsible growth, which is self-evident. You got to grow, no excuses, got to do it with the right risk, got to do it on a sustainable basis. And when we say that, we mean the best place for teammates to work, importantly, sharing our success with our communities, and then driving what we call operational excellence, so we have the money to do it all. And as you think about what happened in these crises, in the healthcare crisis, we first focused on our teammates, and we made sure that we took care of them, kept them as healthy as we could, because we have teammates who are essential workers working every day in our branches and coming to work and with protection and extra pay and trying to help them. Free healthcare, free mental health care, which is a major issue. So we invest in our teammates. Then we support our clients, all the governmental programs in the United States you've heard about, We supported and helped drive the PPP and all these different things to do it. And then we absorbed the business in the normal course of business and huge changes in balance sheet to support our clients and help them through the crisis. But then you had the issues of social justice came up. And so as we thought about that, we had to do something different. So we basically accelerate our investments around social mobility and racial social justice. And so we've always had great programs in this area, but we put an additional $1 billion program on the table over 4 years, which has in it 3 or 4 pillars: education, healthcare, housing, and entrepreneurship. And we've been out deploying that money. So we've invested in the minority depository institutions in the United States, about 10, 12 of them. We've made 5% investments in to give them the capital to grow and serve the community. We just announced that we've done an investment in 25 of the HBCUs and also community colleges in a separate, which serve communities of color and low and moderate communities to provide economic mobility. The 4-year college is around getting better jobs and helping in the career development pathways, and the community college around skills and better jobs in the local communities. And that went out today. And on top of that, we've announced we're putting equity into growth enterprise. That's the entrepreneur piece. And on the healthcare piece, which bridges the point that this healthcare crisis impacted differently the communities, Hispanic communities and African American and Black communities. It's had a higher incidence rate and a higher outcome rate. We basically started driving much geared efforts towards that. The first thing was to provide safety. And so 15 million masks or so have gone out into community centers and healthcare centers and boys and girls clubs, any place that needs masks to help people protect themselves. We put out and continue to put out, well, we're working on strategies of vaccination and testing. Howard University, we did a testing strategy in their neighborhood to help them fund better testing. So you're trying to help with the healthcare crisis, and long term that will turn into more around the social determinants of health and longer term things. Right now you're triaging. And then you go to the environment, which is also sharing your success. We all know the amount of work that has to go on an environment. We all know that's why we have defined in the National Business Health Metrics the environmental scope 1, scope 2 emissions and how you deal with them, a path to carbon neutrality and declaring it, what you're going to do. But to help companies make that happen, to help our clients make that happen, we've created a $300 billion environmental program, which invests dramatically into driving alternative energy sources, research, carbon capture, usage and storage concepts to see if we could actually get them to market and that research and ideas like that. And so it's more traditional alternative energy all the way through the research. And so if you think about the crisis we're facing, whether it's the crisis of the healthcare, it's a crisis of social justice and racial justice, and a crisis of the environment, we are trying to invest along all those dimensions and bring in our capital and frankly our talented teammates to help solve the big issues. So and that's been going on. That is entirely consistent with what I think capitalism has to stand for, to be inclusive capitalism, how we help everybody have equal access to the opportunity, have the economic mobility, which has been studied in the United States and shows vast differences based on the zip code and ethnicity, which shouldn't be there. These are things we're trying to write. And if all companies turn their core business to help here, the entirety of their being, not just their charity, because that'll help some, but their expense base, how they work with vendors, how they work with their, in our case, lending our money, how we work with our alternative energy, you will change these issues and drive them forward. And I think that's the key to defining sustainable capitalism, or more importantly, inclusive capitalism, is that we all take all we do and align it as best we can to help drive against those big crises.
As both Bank of America and TIAA prove, at the council, we believe businesses do best when they act with purpose and on issues where they're in a position to make a real impact for the common good. Roger, TIAA has been very involved in increasing financial literacy, particularly in low and moderate income communities and among people of color. Tell us about the commitments you've made and why this is so important to lasting change and central to economic vibrancy.
Well, you're correct to say that TIAA has long focused on issues of financial literacy in America, particularly in communities of color. And why is that? Well, there's a great deal of research that shows that individuals who have a greater degree of financial literacy tend to save more for retirement, tend to have fewer problems with credit and debt, and tend ultimately, therefore, to be more financially resilient. Unfortunately, the data also show that African American communities tend to have a lower degree of financial literacy than others, and therefore the probability of financial difficulty must go up. So some of the activities that we've taken have been very direct in this space. We have a program that we call FinSights, TIA FinSights. It's a innovative digital financial education program, and it's aimed at college students. And so as of December 31 of last year, more than 7,000 college students at 12 universities participated in our program. And by 2022, a couple of years from now, we'll double that number to more than 15,000 college students. And the goal there is to bring college students into a world of greater financial literacy, hoping to assist them as they then move on to having better financial outcomes. Our bank, TI Bank, sponsors a very innovative program. It's called Bank Money Matters, and it's for schools in Florida, Charlotte, and Puerto Rico. And here we go to grade school students to build a solid financial wellness foundation for them. And this is a multi-year engagement. The bank will reach out to more than 10,000 learners by the end of 2021, and providing more than 20,000 dedicated hours of learning in 100 schools with our own colleagues volunteering to teach fundamentals of financial literacy at the grade school level. We also have for that a digital program, which further expanded to students remotely during COVID so that they wouldn't fall behind on their financial learning. And so we are really quite engaged in this topic of financial literacy. We've also partnered with Savvy to bring onto our institutional campuses for students who have student debt, some programming to help them learn how to use the very complicated but important financial programs, federal programs for student debt forgiveness for those who are in the not-for-profit sector. And already we've seen some savings. On one of our campuses, we believe that students who have student debt and use the forgiveness program may save as much as $50,000 or more a year in terms of debt relief. So we're trying in various different ways to be practical and pragmatic to improve financial literacy in communities of color, because we know that's related to better financial wellness over a lifetime.
Brian, at the council, each member is making concrete commitments for their companies to be more inclusive and sustainable. And those commitments are made according to the International Business Council pillars of prosperity, planet, people, and principles of governance, and then mapped also to the Sustainable Development Goals. But as we've discussed many times, we see our commitments as only step one, because we know that true change will happen only when we're able to scale the practices of inclusive capitalism across industries and really across the globe. So how can the council be an inspiration to other businesses, large and small, to make capitalism more just, sustainable, inclusive, and trusted?
Well, I think to get a group of CEOs and leaders of enterprise together to agree that they run their companies and will run their companies in accordance with these principles of inclusive capitalism. Stakeholder capitalism is what we use in the IBC, inclusive capitalism here. That's critical, because the example of companies like Roger's company, all the things he talked about, we likewise have better money habits, which provides financial education, and many other things we do. The examples, big companies like ours that do things, can be used by others and replicated. And also, even because we use some outside programs, they can use our programs, there's lots of ways to do it. So we get lots of companies committed to it. We share best practices. We figure out where we can go faster working together. In Charlotte, for example, we have a group of CEOs that work together to drive some of the initiatives on economic mobility, and they've done a good job of creating faster growth and jobs in LMI neighborhoods and Title I high schools and various aspects. So I think one, it's a challenge, and it sets a bar high for companies that they're going to do it the right way, capitalism the right way. But two, which means they have to produce profits for the shareholders and what society needs, not or, both. They have to produce both. And by companies committing to do it, showing can be done, and developing programs and practices that can be shared and scaled, that's a good thing. And so I think when companies commit to a council like this, it provides an example of a company not only sort of willing to do it from a moral sort of statement of principles, but when you look in and see the examples that many of my colleagues will share in these dialogues, including in what Roger and I've shared today, of very specific activities. And then you think about a market and how you're going to cooperate with other companies to help drive what that market needs. That's a powerful engine for good, and a powerful engine for inclusive capitalism. So I think that's the value in all this is to get companies together to commit to principles, to then figure out how to operate them locally and work together and learn from each other and go faster than we could otherwise go alone.
Wonderful. Brian, Roger, thank you for being such inspirational leaders and having such great companies doing such great work to make our capitalism more inclusive and sustainable. And thank you for your time today. I know you'll be an inspiration to many who are fortunate enough to listen to this. Thank you.